Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. We are now in the third week of the Ukraine war, and I wanted to discuss a little bit about the limitations that the Russians are facing back at home, economically, and on the battlefield, and it all really comes back to the Russian demographic. The Russian system has faced a number of serious trials and tribulations over the course of the last century. The defeat in World War I gutted a whole generation of young men, which then was insufficient to repopulate, and that generation, the following generation, was gutted in World War II. Khrushchev forced everybody into condos, which reduced the birth rate. Brezhnev presided over a decade of stagnation, which reduced the birth rate. And then ultimately, with the Soviet collapse in 1989, we entered a decade period where the birth rate halved and the death rate doubled. That has generated a massive demographic bomb within the Russian system, and there simply are no longer enough Russians remaining to repopulate the country over the course of the next 30 years. So one way or another, Russia is going to vanish as an ethnicity this century, and one of the major reasons why the Putin government decided that now was the time to launch the invasion of Ukraine is if they didn't do it now, they were going to lose the capacity to do it at all. But there's more going on here than raw numbers. A couple things. First of all, the Russian system educationally is a little bit different from how it is here in the United States. So here you go to high school, you go to college, you enter the workforce. In Russia, you go to high school, and after that you get an apprenticeship rather than university training as a rule. And you are an apprentice for 5-6 years before you then become a skilled craftsman or accountant or whatever it happens to be. Now, back in the mid-1980s, when the bottom really was falling out of the Russian system, the Russians ceased investing in technical education for everyone. If you were connected to the party, you might still be able to get an education, but for most people, it just stopped. It was replaced with ideological indoctrination, which is part of the reason why so many Russians today who are older look at what's going on in Ukraine and just see it as par for the course. They don't have an objection to it because they never received kind of the broad spectrum education that you would get in math and economics and engineering and so on. They were literally raised on the propaganda of the Soviet period. But it also means that the apprenticeship system collapsed. And overall, from roughly 1985 to 1995, the Russian industrial base just stopped. And it's never really come back. And so you have a hard cutoff about 1985 for the last time Russians were educated in large numbers. You play that forward to 95, 2005, 2015, and ultimately 2022, and you're talking about there's been a 35-year gap where no one really was educated. Now, this has a number of implications. First and most importantly, it means that the Russian workforce is one of the least skilled in the world. During the 1990s, when the bottom fell out of the system, over 2 million Russians emigrated to the West in order to find greener pastures. We're seeing an echo of that now. The people who are able to educate themselves or be hired by foreign companies and so get some sort of skills are now in the process of fleeing the country. It's way too soon to know how many that's going to be, but if by the end of the year it's under 500,000 people, I would be very surprised. And these people are utterly irreplaceable because they are the technicians who do all the work that keeps Russia running. The second problem is in the military, because the same sort of educational collapse occurred there. So today's military commanders are nothing like American commanders that go back to school repeatedly through their careers to learn more about history or military technology. And we're seeing that played out on the battlefield across Ukraine right now. It's almost abysmal how badly the Russian military seems to be doing, and it kind of reminds me of the Iraqi military in the Desert Storm conflict, how it just got wiped out by the American forces. Now, the Russians are playing against somebody who's even worse than them, but as you've been seeing in the news, fatalities, casualties have been extremely high. Best guess is that 3 weeks in, the Russians have already lost more troops than the United States did in the entirety of the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan and Iraq. Finally, leadership. In the late Soviet period, starting in roughly 1982, the KGB took over the government. Yuri Andropov, Mikhail Gorbachev, Chernenko, these were all KGBers. And they were the only people in the country who really had the full understanding of what was going on. Putin was one of them. which means that there's a limited cadre to draw from. All of the leadership, all of the political elite within Russia since the Cold War collapsed came from the KGB and were educated before 1985, which means that they probably only have about 150 people total that are capable of meaningful political leadership that is even remotely competent. Compare that to the United States. We have an elite of 2 to 3 million people, and there are any number of ways you can get in. You can come in from business, like Michael Bloomberg. You can come in from reality television, like Donald Trump. You can come in from Hollywood, like Ronald Reagan. You could be a governor, like Bill Clinton. There's a number of routes to national leadership. But in Russia, you're talking 150 people. So every time someone gets sick and dies from COVID, or slips in the shower and falls on some bullets, or ties themselves to a lawn chair and throws themselves in the pool, you are talking about an irreplaceable chunk of talent. We really are in Russia's witching hour. The question is what they are able to do with their last gasp war. This V, this wedge, is populated Russia. It is the part of Russia where it's not so cold that your nose will freeze off in early October. Late October, you're screwed, but early October, you're fine. Now, this orange color here, that's roughly the population density of eastern Nebraska if you melon scoop out Lincoln and Omaha. So you do have neighbors, you will not see them every day. That's populated Russia. On the shoulders, it gets a little less encouraging. So same view, but this is a combined climate and economic map. So the green, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's where everybody lives. The blue, tundra and taigai, nobody lives there. The yellow, desert, nobody lives there. You technically could survive in the beige, but it's not pleasant. All right. When the Russians look at this map, they really hate what they see, because they see a chunk of territory that cannot be defended. They look at it from the point of view of these red hashes. These are the physical boundaries that you can't drive a tank through, or the Mongolians can't horde through. From the Russian point of view, the only way that they can get security is if they can put permanent massed formations in these corridors, the access points to the Russian heartland. When the Soviet Union existed, they controlled all 9 of those access points. It was the most secure the Russian ethnicity had ever been in its existence. When the Soviet Union collapsed and we were left with rump Russia, they went from 9 to 1. In 2007, when the Russians invaded Georgia, they went from 1 to 2. In 2014, when they took Crimea, they went from 2 to 3. Last year, with the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, with the new troops that are there, they went from 3 to 4. They're hoping that the situation in Kazakhstan will stabilize to their benefit, which would take them from 4 to 5. And if they can take Ukraine in its entirety, they would go from 5 to 7. There's a method to the madness. Also means that the Russians can't stop. As Catherine the Great said, the only way that Russia can protect her borders is to expand them. They're not making that up. Does that mean they're going to do it this time around? I have no idea. This is hardly the first time since 2014 that the Russians have chosen to put 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders to dick with them. Could be, but there's nothing to guarantee it. The reason that they haven't moved is because time is really not on their side. Oh yeah, do we have anyone from Texas? Yeah, it's not as big as you think. Time is not on their side. This is the Russian demography, and we're assuming here that the Russians are not lying about the numbers, and they lie about all their numbers. So, you know, this bulge down here probably is not as big as it looks, because back in 2014, they just found 8 million children that they didn't have in the previous year's census. So, but here's the part that really matters. This is the generation that was born in the 1990s and early 2000s. The Cold War collapse. That's draftable age. Yes, the Russians can probably take the country with 130,000 troops, take Ukraine, but they can't hold it. You guys know that from the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Occupying's not easy when the population doesn't want you there. It's a country of 45 million people. That's Iraq plus Afghanistan. And unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, where the population concentrations were pretty tight, Ukraine is farmland. Not possible with 130,000 troops. You're talking 2 million troops. The Russians only have 2 million troops that can play that role. And they are irreplaceable. And once they are deployed, that is it. Russia is done. It is Russia's last war. It's an open question in the United States whether it's better to just let them die over the long term, which they will, or lock them down in a war that is endless, which it would. From the American point of view, these are both equally viable options. The Ukrainians, of course, have an opinion. Bringing this back to the China discussion, Russia and Belarus are the world's second and fourth largest supplier of of potash. Nitrogen fertilizer is disappearing because of what's going on in energy markets. Phosphate fertilizer is disappearing because of what's going on in China. And if this war happens, potash fertilizer globally has a shortage as well. Yes, rifles are an industrial technology, but so is fertilizer. And if you remove all three types of fertilizer